Hello, everybody. On this 150th anniversary of the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, we will take a look at the causes of the fire and how the city rebuilt in the decades leading up to the World's Fair of 1893. We'll take a look at the lessons learned, the mistakes that persisted, and a city that continually remakes itself. Now, around the city, there are reminders of the fires, such as the Pillar of Fire sculpture at the place where the flames began. But some of the vestiges of the fire and its causes are a little bit more subtle. We can find one by looking at a map of the city, and here we're looking at the near south side at the Chicago River's south branch, and a short diagonal street that I have outlined in red there. To give you some context, here is the Google map showing the downtown area of Chicago, and the diagonal street is within that red rectangle there on the screen, southwest of downtown. So I'll zoom back in to our original close-up, thanks to Google Maps here. The diagonal parallels the Chicago River, mainly east of Halsted Street, at the place where the river curves from running mainly south to a more westerly direction. And that diagonal is bisected by Cermak Road, originally 22nd Street. Where we can see the street view now, where at that intersection, where we can see that the name of that diagonal street is Lumber Street. And this southern edge of Chicago was a lumber yard on steroids, an immense city within a city, where the lumber sat on the banks of the river to be shipped out on the canal barges and on the rails to customers in the treeless prairies of Illinois, Iowa, Kansas, and Nebraska. According to Harper's Weekly, the stacks of wood dwarfed the lumber merchants' offices, and an aroma of pine mingled with the smell of sewage from the river. Upriver from the lumber district, closer to the fork of the river, Chicago merchants met ships from Lake Michigan mill towns, examined their contents, and bought wood by the boatload. It was the world's largest lumber market in the decades following 1850. Now, the voracious appetite of the Chicago lumber market demanded a steady supply of the vast white pine forests in Wisconsin and Michigan. The forests had grown for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and they were clear-cut, first near the lake shores, then along the tributary rivers and streams. And it certainly was known at the time that this was not sustainable, but the urgency of now took precedent over the concerns for the future. This lumber was the kindling that would later help light the Great Chicago Fire, but it was also the fuel that kept Chicago's economic engines running in the early years of the city's rise to commercial prominence. Dealing in lumber brought great wealth and reward to the city, but it was a reward with a built-in and very knowable risk. And the inevitable end came at the end of the 20th century up in Wisconsin and Michigan, when the deforested areas known as the cutover was a land laid waste. Cutover was the ultimate risk of feeding the demands of a market with no thought toward what tomorrow may bring. But there were other risks along the way, much earlier, when disaster did indeed strike. In a great conflagration, when the white pine market was far from depleted, when there was plenty of fuel for the fire of commerce still. Literally, a great fire on October 8, 1871, when that deadly fire led to mass destruction in Peshtigo, Wisconsin. It was up in Wisconsin in the evening darkness, around 10 o'clock. A low rumbling sound grew louder into a roar. The sound was described as like a freight train or a huge rushing waterfall. Peshtigo was a center for lumber mills and wood manufacturing in northeast Wisconsin. And the fire would extend across an entire region on both sides of Green Bay, extending into the upper peninsula of Michigan. It's often cited as the deadliest fire in American history. In the area, they often use fire to clear forest land for agriculture, but on this day, a strong wind fanned those fires out of control, creating firestorms. By the time the fire was brought under control, as many as 2,500 people had died, 2,400 square miles were burned, equal to about 1.3 million acres of the forest consumed. It was an industrial town, but there were 16 smaller towns that were also destroyed, along with an estimated 2 billion trees. Now, in comparison, the Chicago fire on the same day was much less deadly, much smaller in scope, but then as now, when something happens in a big city, it generally gets the bigger press. The Chicago fire certainly could have been much worse, as the city's population at the time was nearly 300,000. But since the first area to be affected was in the commercial district, the fact that it started on a Sunday evening rather than during the week meant that many businesses were closed and many people in the line of fire had time to flee. Now, since both Peshtigo and Chicago fires happened on the same evening, it's often thought that they may have been more than coincidence, that there might have been a cause in common. A fringe theory, first proposed in 1883, was that they were caused by the fragments from the breakup of the comet Biela, coming to Earth in the form of a meteor shower. But there are no credible reports of a meteor shower that day, so this is largely debunked. What Peshtigo and Chicago did share was unusually dry weather that year. The fall and winter of 1870 were dry, followed by an even drier spring and summer of 1871. Marshes had become so dry that local Native Americans couldn't use their canoes to gather their wild rice. Rivers were so shallow that logs were stacked alongside of them, waiting for rain. In October, a huge low-pressure cell formed in the west, and causing a counterclockwise spinning that led to the whirling firestorms reported during both fires. And no, Mrs. O'Leary's cow did not knock over a lantern, not in Chicago nor in Peshtigo. For one thing, it would have taken the cow over 80 hours of continuous walking to get from Peshtigo to Chicago. So if the cow did start the Peshtigo fire, it would have been over, the Chicago fire would have been over by the time the cow got here. And he'd been way too tired by then, or she would have been way too tired by then to have enough energy left over to kick over a lantern. No, Mrs. O'Leary nor her cow, they didn't start the fire, they didn't light it, and they did try to fight it. But the two fires really were caused by the same thing, and that was market demand. The lumber market was a perverse combination of high demand being met by an excessive number of competing suppliers with vast access to a vast amount of resources in wood. Competition meant the Wisconsin and Michigan lumber suppliers were in a race to the bottom, cutting prices to outsell each other, thus depending on cutting more and more trees, increasing the volume of production to turn a profit. The result of this was literally an overheated market that was where few of the people involved worried about the consequences of their overproduction and the lack of sustainability that deforestation would cause. Few worried about the risks inherent in processing, warehousing, and transporting those flammable products. They were pursuing the profit of the present with no regard for what, in hindsight, was an obviously predictable firestorm. And also fueling the inevitable fire was Chicago's rapid growth, meaning that buildings were built in the most rapid way possible. This map shows elements of Chicago in 1833, the year of incorporation of Chicago as a town with a population of 350. Among the structures mainly built of timber was Fort Dearborn on the south bank of the Chicago River and the shore of Lake Michigan. Other structures pictured on the map include the Temple Church building, shared by several denominations before their own separate churches were built. At the fork of the river, known as Wolf Point, the Saguenash Hotel on the left, the Wolf Tavern on the right, and the first post office built of logs in the center. And South Water Street would become known as Wacker Drive in the 1920s. But in 1934, it was home to a row of wooden structures, mainly warehouses for goods coming to town from lake traffic. State Street was just a half a mile south of the river. Here in 1836, it was still a country road this far south, with a lone wooden building. Travelers continuing south from here could get all the way to Danville, and they could keep going if they wanted to all the way to Vincennes, former state capital of Indiana, and it was the territorial capital when what is now Illinois was still part of Indiana Territory prior to 1809. So State Street was also known at different times as State Road, the Vincennes Trace, and after Gurdon Hubbard settled in Danville, well, that portion from here to there was known as Hubbard's Trace. So when Chicago got its new charter as a city in 1837, its population had swelled to 4,000, and its first mayor was real estate investor and businessman William B. Ogden. He wanted a home here that was more elaborate than what the average carpenter could just throw together, So he brought a professional architect to town from the east, John Van Osdel. In 1853, the city was now over 30,000 and growing quickly, adding an average of 8,000 new residents every year. The lumber industry was well established. The canal had been open for nearly 5 years, shipping freight between Great Lakes and the Mississippi River, and the railroads were moving goods to and from the settled east. This panorama here shows the North Division in 1857, looking west from Pine Street, which is we now know as Michigan Avenue. Holy Name Church is on the upper right in the yellow circle there at Chicago Avenue and State Street. And on this block, it's a prime example of how the North Division had homes of the rich and famous, 1850s edition. This entire block was for the home of William B. Ogden, as designed by Van Osdel. Surrounded by his landscape gardens, the city's upper crust lived in very naturalistic settings in neighborhoods of very low density. Now, as Chicago grew, its city hall evolved from leased space in the saloon building here to a simple frame building, to the first government building in 1848, which is right there, and then in 1853, a combined city hall and courthouse designed by John Van Osdel that would be expanded with a new top floor, new wings, to look like this by the year of the fire. And that made the dome of the City Hall and Courthouse the highest place in Chicago. And so, of course, in 1858, someone went up to the top to not only see the view, but to photograph the panorama. And the panorama was then published, and so now we can get an idea of how the city looked when its population was topping 110,000. Here is a view to the northeast of the City Hall, and we have where the Thompson Center would be now, and then to the right of that is where the Daily Center is now, and then around the corner, we're looking due east at the block beyond Clark Street towards the lake. Randolph Street's on your left, Washington Street's on your right, in the middle near the number 21, if you can see it there. Well, that's where the Picasso statue stands now. And if we look southeast, the buildings at the southeast corner of Clark and Washington was the Methodist Church, that I just circled, and a succession of Methodist church buildings would continue at that site. Still today, it's the location of the Chicago Temple building. The church right of center, marked number 36, well, that's the First Presbyterian Church back then. And as we turn this way, looking southwest at the intersection of LaSalle and Washington, left of center is the First Baptist Church. And the current Board of Trade building would be about back here, where you see the number 41. If we look due west, we see Washington on the left, Washington Street, Randolph Street on the right, LaSalle in the foreground, and number 49 in the background. Well, that's the northwest corner of Randolph and Market Street. Market Street is now known as Wacker Drive, and that's the Lind block in that yellow circle. One of the few buildings that would survive the fire. And the Cadillac Palace Theater, well, that would be right about here now, on Randolph, west of LaSalle. Now, and we're going back, looking northwest again, bringing us back to where the Thompson Center stands right there. Now, swinging back east to Clark and Washington, we'll take a closer look at Clark Street south of Washington, where the early frame buildings were placed in 1868 with more substantial structures with stone and masonry construction. The Steinway piano sign on this building in the foreground, well, that's the building that replaced that first Presbyterian church we just saw. But even these new buildings had timber beams and columns, and roofs were often covered in flammable tar. And of course, inside was filled with pine furnishings, paper, wood, and cloth. Now, in residential neighborhoods pre-fire, a few working class families could afford brick homes. But even some commercial structures, like this depot for the Chicago Northwestern Railroad, were of wood frame construction. In the vicinity of the water tower and pumping station at Pine Street on the north side, again, later on North Michigan Avenue, this is a romanticized view that, however, still does show the wooden sidewalks, standard throughout the city. And the city's water system was a major technological advance for Chicago in 1869. It made possible the deployment of an extensive system of fire hydrants. So here we see both the wooden walkways that would speed the fire spread and one of the city's most important defenses against the fire when it should start. Now, the many frame buildings were substantial structures, not just workers' cottages. Many frame buildings had brick and stone foundations. And the house on the right in this picture was actually downtown on Monroe Street, right next to the Palmer House Hotel. And it's typical of the Greek Revival balloon frame houses of the day. Now, balloon framing became possible due to the availability of standardized milled lumber. But also important was the availability of a way of joining the wood pieces together. The technological advance of that time of the 1800s was inexpensive machine-made nails. Prior to this, nails were made individually by blacksmiths or craftsmen to order, and they were very, very expensive. So before cut nails were available, skilled carpenters were needed for lumber frame buildings, where the pieces were joined by complicated mortise and tenon joints, kept in place by wooden pegs or wedges. But with 2x4s and nails, a much lower skill level was needed to put up balloon frames quickly. Now, the name balloon frame is often misunderstood. There's an urban legend that a craftsman by the name of Augustine Taylor was building St. Mary's Church in Chicago in 1833, while some skilled carpenters were looking on at that comparatively thin framing, all held together with nails, and they declared that this method of construction, well, it's no more substantial than a balloon. It would surely blow over in the next wind. Well, whether that happened or not is not really important, because the name balloon framing actually has nothing to do with balloons filled with air. It comes with a French Missouri type of construction, and I cannot pronounce French, so I guess this is something like maison and boulin, I don't know. But boulin being a French term for a horizontal scaffolding support, the 2-story height of most studs used in balloon framing made it necessary to use scaffolding platforms for workers to stand on during construction. So the low cost and speed of construction made balloon framing very popular, especially in fast-growing Chicago. But balloon framing also made the structure less resistant to the spread of fire. In the walls, the space between the studs in a 2-story building went from ground to roof. So those spaces could act like chimneys, allowing air to flow freely upward. And therefore a fire that started on the first floor could quickly spread up the walls and consume the entire structure. So the Great Chicago Fire would consume a huge portion of the city. In those days, the city was divided into 3 parts, separated by the Chicago River. The North Division was north of the main branch and east of the North Branch. The West Division was west of the river, and on the south it was north of the I&M Canal. And the South Division was south of the main branch and east of the South Branch. So the fire would affect all 3 divisions and would destroy more of the North Division in terms of size, but cause the most loss of commercial real estate in the South Division south of the main branch. Fire was noticed in the West Division on DeKoven Street around 9 p.m. on Sunday, October 8, 1871. Neighbor Daniel Sullivan saw flames coming from the O'Leary's barn and ran to alert Catherine and Patrick O'Leary. They lived with their 5 children in the small back cottage. They rented out the front building. Their barn was in the back with 4 cows, a calf, a horse, along with Catherine's milk wagon. Only the calf would be saved. The city had a fairly advanced electric fire alarm system with alarm boxes placed throughout all 3 divisions. The keys to the boxes were trusted to community members, usually a local shopkeeper. And an O'Leary neighbor ran to a drugstore owned by Bruno Gall, who promptly opened the box and threw the switch. The system would send a signal to an operator at the City Hall and Courthouse downtown. However, it malfunctioned. The system failed. It was not until 9:30 that a watchman on the roof of the Fire Engine Company No. 6 saw the flames. They proceeded north and started to fight the flames, but the spread was already out of control. Now, it's possible that if the first alarm had not failed, a quicker response could have contained the fire to the O'Leary neighborhood. The fire was pushed mainly southwest by the prevailing wind, but it spread in all directions to some extent. On the east, the rail yards and right-of-way of the Rock Island Railroad helped serve as a fire break, saving much of the lower South Division from the blaze. The prevailing winds also served to spare St. Patrick Church, which had been built in 1856. fire would consume everything east of the church. Old St. Pat's survival meant that today it's Chicago's oldest remaining church. Now, most structures further north in the West Division were spread due to a previous fire that had burned on this area that I circled in yellow on October 7th, the Saturday night. A lack of anything left to burn in that area stopped further northern spread west of the river. Now, although Union Depot was not so lucky, being situated on the west bank of the river, but it was a total loss. Early on, it was hoped that the river itself would be a natural fire break, but flaming debris was carried by the wind, and just past midnight, the first building to catch fire in the South Division was 400 feet east of the river, a 3-story brick stable of the Parmalee Omnibus and Stage Company. It was a new $80,000 building that was part of the company that transferred travelers between hotels and train stations in the city. The debris blew onto the roof, which was made of wood covered in tar paper, and then the fire spread to neighboring buildings. The fire at first spread mainly north, giving some hope that the eastern portion of downtown might be spared. But most buildings in the fire's path were destroyed. One that would survive was the Lind Block, a substantial building on the far northwest corner of the South Division near the river fork at Randolph and Market Street. And the Lind Block would actually survive all the way until 1963, when it was knocked down for a taller building. And the survival of the Lind was perhaps understandable, since it was near the river and the fire was pushing mainly away from it. More miraculous, though, was the survival of the Nixon building. This 6-story building at Monroe and LaSalle Streets was indeed designed to be fire resistant. It had iron joists, concrete covered beams, brick arches, marble floors, and plaster of Paris ceilings. But its survival really was a fluke, because there were plenty of other buildings with similar construction that did succumb to the flames. Now, these survivors were the only ones in the South Division. As the flames spread north, many people first sought refuge in the public square right next to the City Hall and Courthouse. But soon they were forced to flee further, heading either north or west across the rivers. With the abandonment of the courthouse, any chance of using the alarm system, which was controlled from there, well, that was all gone. And up in the courthouse cupola, the fire ate through the supports of the massive 5.5-ton bell, and the bell plummeted through, collapsing the rest of the building at 2 o'clock in the morning. It was about 2:30 a.m. When the debris blowing across the main branch of the river landed in the North Division on a train belonging to the Chicago Northwestern Railroad. All the rail cars were full of kerosene, literally supplying fuel for the fast spread of the fire in the north. So now it spread all through the North Division. The pumping station and water tower at Pine Street and Chicago Avenue were limestone, and since the water tower contained little more than a standpipe, it had very little flammable material, and it withstood the flames. But at 3:20 a.m., an enormous firebrand about 12 feet long sailed onto the pumping station's roof. The interior was on fire within minutes, and all 3 of the station's steam engines broke down. That meant the city's water system was thus shut down, and no more water being pumped to the fire hydrants. A few blocks northwest of the water tower, another of the buildings that survived miraculously was the home of Malin Ogden, a lawyer and brother of William B. Ogden, Chicago's first mayor. Malin Ogden was out of town, and his servants managed to douse carpets with water and used those doused carpets to cover the home's roof. It certainly helped save the home, although people in nearby buildings tried the same thing without success. Now, near the northern edge of the city, the home of policeman Robert Bellinger withstood the flames as well. In advance of the approach of the fire, Bellinger and a family member cleared dry leaves from their lot, ripped out the wooden fence and sidewalk from the front, and poured buckets of water over the roof. 2 blocks to the north, Fullerton Avenue marked the northern edge of the city, where there were no buildings and nothing but prairie. But the fire ended early Tuesday morning, 30 hours before it began. Now, going back a little bit, back in the South Division, Robert Todd Lincoln was the sole surviving son of Mary and Abraham Lincoln, and he was a 28-year-old lawyer at the time. In the early morning hours of Monday, he was able to get from his home south of 12th Street, in the area that never burned, to his law office on East Lake Street to retrieve important documents that he carried away tied into a bundle made from a tablecloth. And then as he walked home, he stopped at the home of his law partner's father, a longtime family friend, another lawyer and banker. His name was J. Young Scammon, and he lived at Terrace Row, which was a luxurious set of townhouses on Michigan Avenue between Van Buren and Congress Streets. As the fire had spread north, they were assuming that Terrace Row and its surroundings would make it through without harm. Lincoln would later say that he ate breakfast with Scammon around 8 a.m. and, quote, he left with a feeling of perfect security. Now, after breakfast, Lincoln walked home south of 12th Street, and around midday on Monday, the fire started spreading south again. There was fire devils forming like swirling tornadoes of flame, which bucked the wind and spread southeast to Wabash and Michigan Avenues. The fire now spent the rest of Monday making its way south, reaching the southern end at Harrison Street, where they tried to use started to use some explosives to stop the spread of the fire, and it might have worked. But at 3 a.m. in the morning on Tuesday, October 10th, 1871, the fire was finally over. In the 30 hours, 300 people had died. The North Division had the largest area of damage, where over 13,800 pre-fire buildings, well, all but 500 of them were destroyed. It leveled vast German and Scandinavian neighborhoods. Damage in the South Division was smaller in area but greater in dollar loss, since that was the entire downtown commercial district. The flames destroyed almost all of the city's banks, 3 of the 4 downtown railroad stations, the offices of the insurance companies, law firms, 1,600 stores, 28 hotels, 60 factories, 39 of the city's 165 churches. In the immediate aftermath of the fire, city leaders took stock of the damage and started making recovery plans. I hit the wrong thing there, pardon me. We can go back to full screen there. There we go. The printing presses of all the newspapers had been destroyed, but the publisher of the Tribune, Joseph Medill, he was able to arrange for a small printing press in the West Division to be his emergency production plant. He was able to put out the first post-fire edition of the Trib on Wednesday, October 11th, with an editorial stating, "Cheer up, Chicago shall rise again." Now, Mayor Roswell Mason was nearing the end of his one and only 2-year term. Chicago was divided by economic class. There was a mainly Protestant group of native-born economic and social elites, and a working class made up principally of new immigrants or the children of immigrants. And the largest groups were the Irish, the German, and smaller groups of Bohemians and Scandinavians. Many of the working class were Catholic. The disdain of the elite for the working class led Mason to make decisions after the fire that were probably illegal, certainly beyond his official powers. Rather than rely on the city's police force to provide safety and security after the fire, Mason entrusted Army General Philip Sheridan with the preservation of the good order and peace of the city. Even though there was no rampant looting or criminality, Mason's disdain for the working class led him to overreact and declare martial law. Right after the fire, the city council organized the General Relief Committee to take charge of collecting and distributing all of the aid coming to the city from around the world. The mayor and the civic elites considered the council and the voters that elected them to be incompetent and corrupt. The elites were outraged that the committee was allowing anyone who asked to receive food and supplies. How in the world did they know these people were truly in need? So within a week, the mayor replaced the city council's relief committee with a private entity called the Relief and Aid Society, made up entirely of upper economic class men. They put in place a complicated application process in which applicants had to prove they were looking for work. A large swath of the working class were not literate, or in many cases, among the European immigrants, they could read but not in English, and thus needed assistance of someone who could. Joseph Medill's Tribune editorialized in favor of the Relief and Aid Society's weeding out of those, quote, greedy impostors who were salivating at the chance of bellying up to the aid trough, those lusty men and women who assumed they would now be fed and clothed by others. And the Trib said that what the city needed most is for people to get back. Quoting, 1,000 men were needed at good wages to rebuild the burn district. But why would anyone lift a finger if you received relief assistance regardless of whether he found a job? And for the women, there was another 1,000 domestic positions in respectable families, also at good pay. But what woman would take a job if she could obtain aid, even if remaining idle? So by this logic, aid was available to those with income, but not to the people who really needed it and had absolutely nothing. Now, a curfew was put in place, and the citizens were admonished to stay out of the burn district. There were damaged walls still falling, but a real estate agent named W.D. Kerfoot erected this sign at the site of his former office at Washington and LaSalle Streets, and it was directing people to his temporary location near Union Park in the West Division. Then the temporary building Kerfoot built in Union Park was quickly moved east to his pre-fire location at 89 Washington, so he was able to claim to be the first business to return to the burn district. And this coffee house in the burn district was one of 6,000 temporary wood structures built in the weeks after the fire. Soon the ramshackle business district was growing downtown south of Lake Street on LaSalle, across from the ruins of Courthouse Square. Some businesses had just started selling from makeshift stands such as Schock, Big Ford and Company, selling cigars, tobacco, grapes, apples, and cider, and according to the sign, selling it at old prices. The City Council had in fact passed an ordinance freezing prices at pre-fire levels for most goods and setting fines for anyone found to be price gouging. In this post-fire illustration, a young man is turned into an entrepreneur by selling fragments of the burned city that he had collected. He's sitting in an overturned safe, and he's selling a doll to a couple and their daughter, and there are other relics of the fire on the board in front of him. The most actively marketed relic of the fire was the bell that fell from the rooftop cupola of the courthouse. This photo shows a boy sitting in the large fragment of the bell. The city sold the bell at auction, and by December 1871, its new owner had melted it down and turned it into souvenirs. The items made include commemorative medals and small replicas of the bell sold in velvet-lined polished wooden boxes that came with a certificate of authenticity signed by the city's Board of Public Works. And one resourceful Chicagoan built a restaurant in the North Division and called it the Relic House. It was actually built of fire relics, blocks of molten iron, glass, china, stones, pipes, bottles, plates, sewing machines, dolls' heads, and iron toys all made up the walls. It was located on Clark Street near Armitage, and it remained a popular beer garden and restaurant for nearly 60 years. Now, the City Council allowed several businesses to open temporary buildings along the east side of Michigan Avenue north of Congress, across the street from the ruins of the Terrace Row. Soon the city would start to dump refuse from the fire into the lake. Actually, let me go back to that for 1 second. There we go. The city would start to dump refuse from the fire into the basin behind these buildings. I marked that in green in the background there. That is where they filled in a basin that was between the shore and the breakwater. It would create the first strip of Lake Park, which would expand and be renamed Grant Park in the early 1900s. But the city went further, approving more substantial buildings to be built in Lake Park, east of Michigan Avenue, including Battery D here, located where today we'd see the Crown Fountain in Millennium Park. This was an event space for fairs and charity balls and was still there in the 1880s. It was one of the buildings that Montgomery Ward would later sue to have it torn down when he successfully argued to the Illinois Supreme Court that Chicago's lakefront was to be kept forever open, clear, and free of any obstructions whatsoever. Now, the fire left 100,000 people homeless, about 1/3 of the city's residents. Most of the upper class had resources to find shelter. Some left town for a while, and they were able to rebuild within a few months. The vast majority of the homeless were the working class, and the largest area was the North Division. They spent the first weeks and months in makeshift shanties like this. Many Chicagoans on the low end of the economic scale had lived in apartments or rented homes, so those were scattered throughout all three divisions. Many of them lived above retail stores or in the warehouse and industrial districts. Barracks were built to house them in all three divisions, including this one in Washington Square, and they were truly barracks. They were shared living spaces with privies outside. Across the street, and this one here was across the street from Malin Ogden's home, one of the few structures that we saw that was left over after the fire. And this area here, where is another area where there was a barracks built, would become known as Little Hell. After the barracks were torn down, there was still very substandard housing there, without indoor plumbing. And this was located just south of Division Street. It would be one of the last areas of the city with dirt streets. It was where later Al Capone's rival, Dion O'Banion, lived. He would go on to run the North Side Irish Gang during Prohibition. And Little Hell wasn't cleared out until after World War II, when it was replaced with the Cabrini Green public housing project. The Relief and Aid Society helped the better class of the homeless, and they defined the better class as those working people who had already owned their own lots and who were in many cases skilled laborers. These people were provided with the materials and plans to build basic temporary homes on their lots. The materials for the shelter homes, as they were called, cost about $125. They were provided to those better class people, paid for by the aid funds that were pouring into the city. Two lumber company executives were on the Aid Society committee overseeing the distribution, and to no one's surprise, their lumber companies were paid market rates for the materials that they were providing. The rebuilding in the working class neighborhoods was slowed due to a controversy about fireproof construction. In November 1871, Tribune publisher Joseph Medill was elected mayor on the fireproof ticket. It was an ad hoc political party formed for that single election. He said on election night that the fire was caused by the city's blind, unreasoning infatuation with pine, meaning a pine for a building material for external walls. And he advocated changing the city code to forbid using wood on the external walls of any building in the city, requiring fireproofing and materials that were fireproof for roofing. Now, while the city's new mayor and city council debated fireproof construction, wooden buildings were going up everywhere. People needed shelter for the winter, and aldermen for the working class argued people could not afford brick or stone. And the fire was proof that stone and brick by themselves were not sufficient to deter the fire. And there was lumber, though, in huge supply, since these vast rail yards along the south branch of the river had been outside of the burn district. So there was a market demand for lumber and plenty of supply to be had. Now, some of the more substantial structures in the downtown area started getting built in spring 1872. Well, they got off to a fast start thanks to John Van Osdol. Now, this is the Palmer House that he had designed back in 1871, which had opened its first overnight guests on September 26, 1871. About 400 guest rooms were ready, but construction work was still ongoing. The basement was unfinished. Its floor was still dirt. And after the fire started, Van Osdol ran to his office, grabbed all of the plans and records he could carry. He took them into the basement of the Palmer House and buried them in the dirt. The supposedly fireproof hotel was a complete and total loss. But when Van Osdol came to the ruins, he was able to dig through the rubble to discover that the fire had baked the dirt into a solid mass that he had to chisel through. The soil contained high amounts of clay minerals, and actually was very good for making bricks. And when he broke through the baked earth, the records and plans he had buried were intact. He used them to quickly rebuild many of his former designs in the downtown area. A new, bigger Palmer House rose on the same site, and thanks to Van Osdol's quick thinking, many more buildings were able to quickly grow around it. So here is how State Street looked south of Lake Street in the late 1860s, just a few years before the fire. And here is the same viewpoint. looking south from the lake in the 1880s, a decade after the fire. This is rebuilt Chicago, since all the buildings in the left image were all burned and destroyed. The difference in the two pictures that you see is on the left, the street rail is pulled by horses, and on the right, we have cable cars instead. But those buildings look very similar. They almost look identical. And that's how they were rebuilding Chicago in the way it was before. After using a few rented spaces for civic business, the temporary post-fire City Hall building was opened in 1873 at LaSalle and Adams. The corner had been known as the Old Reservoir because it was home to a water tank, an obsolete remnant of the city's water system prior to 1869, when they opened the newer water tower and pumping station on the north side. So the City Hall was built in an L shape around that tank. The tank and the new City Hall were soon home to a large flock of crows, which perched along the edges of the water tank and along the roof. Now, crows are omnivores that farmers considered pests since they would feast on their crops, and crows also eat carrion, decaying flesh of dead animals. But to the eye of Chicago's European immigrants, the crows resembled a bird they knew back in Europe, the rook. And the city council was still rebuilding, so anyone looking to find work in clearing the city of rubble or in assisting in construction, they would come to City Hall in hopes of getting a contract from city officials. So in some newspapers, the crows, or rooks, were used as a metaphor for the people who were looking to feast on the carcass of dead pre-fire Chicago. Thus, City Hall became known by a new name, and that name was the Rookery. Another of Chicago's pre-fire architects was William W. Boynton. He had designed the water tower. He lost his home and office in the fire, but soon was back to work on the rebuild. It was a point of great civic pride in 1873 when the Van Buren station that Boynton designed was open for business. The Rock Island Line and the Lakeshore and Southern Michigan trains were now able to arrive and depart downtown Chicago from a brand new depot. Boynton's Grand Pacific Hotel, which he designed for the Rock Island Railroad, had been set to open in 1871, but the fire happened before any overnight guests could enjoy its luxury. So he had to rebuild it. The replacement opened in 1873. It could boast being the largest hotel in the U.S. and luxury on par with the rival Palmer House. Boynton's Interstate Industrial Exposition Building opened on the east side of Michigan across from the terminus of Adams Street. It was a vast exhibition space designed to reestablish confidence after the fire. And it was basically located in the same spot that we see the Art Institute of Chicago today, just at the, again, at the terminus of Adams on the east side of Michigan. It hosted trade shows, drawing business leaders from across the U.S. back to Chicago. And it was home to summer night concerts by the Chicago Symphony Orchestra and grand operas by various companies. It became a symbol of Chicago's confidence that it would continue to rise like a phoenix from the ashes. But there were smoldering problems that were slowing progress. The sheer enormity of the fire caused many insurance companies to go under. Home Insurance and the Hartford were among those able to cover their policyholders' losses. And pioneering Chicago settler Gurdon Hubbard, he was an agent for Aetna, and he helped cover the losses to his customers by selling his own personal property. But out of the 129 fire insurance companies with policyholders in Chicago, 58 of them were driven into bankruptcy. Only half of the claims were ever paid. All told, insurance only covered about a third of the total cost of the fire. And then the economic activity worldwide came to a screeching halt. The panic of 1873 caused the collapse of many banks and a closure of the New York Stock Exchange. By November 1873, 55 of the nation's railroads had failed, 60 more had gone bankrupt. Construction of new rail lines plummeted from 7,500 miles of track in 1872 to just 1,600 miles of track in 1875. And with the importance of the rail lines to the city, this hit Chicago especially hard. 18,000 businesses failed between 1873 and 1875 throughout the country. Unemployment peaked in 1878 at 8.25%. Business construction was halted, wages were cut, real estate values fell, corporate profits vanished. This period would be called the Great Depression, until an even worse economic catastrophe happened in the 1930s. Recovery in Chicago went into a long pause as the economic woes didn't let up until a slow improvement in 1879. And then before that, in 1874, it happened again. Chicago had learned no lesson. The fire of 1874 took place on July 14th, burning 47 acres in the South Division, south of the burn district from the previous fire. It destroyed 812 structures, killed 20 people. This affected neighborhood had been home to Chicago's Jewish immigrants from Russia and Poland, as well as a significant population of African American families. Both ethnic groups were displaced in the aftermath to other neighborhoods in the West and South Divisions. Black residents would move to the area that would become known as Bronzeville, and the Jewish neighborhood would take root in North Lawndale. And the fire insurance industry now demanded reforms in Chicago. They were tired of paying out claims in a city that wouldn't fix its own problems. As this Tribune article from 1874 October states, the National Board of Underwriters had demanded widespread changes in fire prevention and firefighting. Many insurance companies canceled policies and stopped accepting new clients until reforms were put in place in the city. So the underwriters demanded fire patrols, an expansion of the water system capacity with larger water mains and more pumping stations, and an enforced ban on any new frame buildings within the original corporate limits of the city. So while the Great Depression of the 1870s slowed the economy to a crawl, the city had another issue to deal with. Included in all of the aid that had been flowing into Chicago from around the world, it occurred to some people, including the Queen of England, that the Chicago fire had likely wiped out our public library. So books came from everywhere, including 8,000 from Britain, among those were private donations from people like Alfred Lord Tennyson, Robert Browning, John Stuart Mill. And what might have been a surprise to many of those donors is that before this, Chicago didn't even have a public library, so there was nothing to replace. But they did use these books in the city from around the world as a great excuse to actually start our first public library. But the question was where to put them. With the city stalled on a rebuilding, the proper library building was going to be a future endeavor. The books had to go somewhere safe, and the answer was actually right above the heads of the city council in the rookery. Above and behind the rookery, there was that unused water tank. It had survived the fire, so it was likely one of the safest places to store books. Here's what the water tank looked like before the fire, before they built the rookery around it. And through the doors and up the rickety stairs, the water tank became the reading room of Chicago's first public library. Now, as the country came out of the Great Depression of the 1870s, the pent-up demand for investment caused the value of downtown Chicago real estate to skyrocket. Among the companies wishing to establish themselves in Chicago was the Home Insurance Company. They were one of the fire insurance firms that had paid all claims from the Chicago fires, and with that they had expanded their client base in the ensuing years thanks to the trust people had in them. But with the high cost of downtown land, innovations were needed to make the land here and building on it profitable. Taller buildings would mean more rentable office space, but no one was going to take the stairs all the way up more than 3 floors or so taller buildings required safe, dependable elevators. And so the Home Insurance Company hired an architect with a new, very innovative idea. His name was William LeBaron Jenney. His innovation was to use steel in a building's interior structure so the outer walls would not have to bear all the weight of the building. This would allow the buildings to be taller. Let me just go back to that slide for 1 second. That went too fast. It would allow the building to be taller with more rentable space within, larger windows for interior light, and not just more rentable office space on the same footprint of a smaller building, but therefore more desirable office space than older buildings that had thicker walls and smaller windows. Now, that was just across the street from the crows at the rookery. Those crows are going to have to find a new place to roost soon because a new elevator building replaced the water tank in City Hall. And since the public was used to calling a building on this corner the rookery, the name was attached to the new building as well. So even if the crows were not welcome, As a playful nod to that name, the architects made the atrium lobby resemble a birdcage, but the only caged creatures were the office workers. And since in these early years many people were afraid of going up in these tall buildings, the architects, Daniel Burnham and John Root, took the top floor of the building for themselves. So their daily elevator ride to the top would demonstrate how safe the building was. Now, Chicago boosters were actively advertising Chicago as a great place to visit, to see the great new buildings, and to enjoy a summer getaway from the Midwest heat, thanks to the cool breezes off of Lake Michigan. So in the early 1880s, these boosters were calling Chicago the Windy City. But newspapers in rival Midwestern towns that did not have those lake breezes to boast about, they started using the term derisively to refer to the windy, talkative, boastful boosters from Chicago. So visitors and new residents were flocking into the city. The population swelled from nearly 300,000 in 1870 to over a million by 1889. And then in 1889, surrounding townships voted whether to be voluntarily annexed to the city. The chance to be part of Chicago's state-of-the-art public water and sewer systems and the growing public services provided an irresistible impetus for the majority of voters to vote to annex. So on election night, the city gained 125 square miles and 225,000 people. They passed Philadelphia to become the second in population. The Windy City was now the second city as well. So by the time of the 1893 World's Fair, the city population had topped 1 million. And more than 27 million people attended the exposition during its 6-month run. And Rand McNally that year published a detailed guide to Chicago that boasted of the city's unprecedented growth and great accomplishments in recovering from the fires. This bird's eye view and guide of Chicago, well, the bird's eye view were graphic examples of how Chicago's tall buildings were beginning to soar to greater heights while they were surrounded by a vast sea of structures that were earlier built when Chicago first pulled itself out of the ashes. So here's a sampling of Chicago as seen from the viewpoint of one of the rookery's crows soaring over the city. Chicago at the time of the World's Fair, it was a mixture of transformations. The revolutionary Chicago School of Architecture was just beginning to replace the previous Chicago, which itself had grown out of the ashes of the fire. If you walk around Chicago today, you can see a handful of buildings from that first transformation that still stand. There's these were ones that were built in 1872 to 1874, just after the fire. There's a group of buildings here on Lake Street, east of Franklin. It's an official city landmark, the whole group. It's the largest group of post-fire buildings still standing downtown. And then there's the beautifully restored Delaware building, also a landmark at the northeast corner of Dearborn and Randolph. Across from the street from the Cultural Center, this is a building that stands mid-block between Michigan and Wabash. And next to the Chicago Theater, John Van Ossel's Page Building is also a landmark. And these post-fire buildings are on Adams Street, east of State. And west of State, the Berghoff restaurant occupies the second largest collection of remaining post-fire buildings. And this new construction is going on right now on the north side, new frame construction, well within the original burn district. So these buildings made of wood show that the fire code has certainly changed since that period after the fire when construction like this was banned. And on the short remnant of DeKoven Street, east of Jefferson, the Chicago Fire Academy is where cadets learn their craft. It's where we find the Pillar of Fire sculpture. It stands on the very spot where Mrs. O'Leary and her cow were wrongly accused of starting the fire. Among her 5 children was James Patrick. He was 2 years old at the time. He would later grow up to be quite successful, albeit in some very risky ventures. Big Jim O'Leary would become the gambling kingpin of Chicago's South Side. He became quite wealthy at that chosen profession. So he built himself a mansion on Garfield Boulevard, which is currently on the market. So it could be yours if you would like a 12-bedroom, 5.5 bath fixer-upper. It seems Mr. O'Leary was leery of fire risks, said to be the only private residence with its own fire hydrant located at the back of the property near the alley. Big Jim clearly had some pull with the right people in government to get that. And this face of molded terracotta in the facade on the upper floor is thought to be the likeness of his mother, Catherine O'Leary. And of course, the true topper that shows his lifelong devotion to his mother is that the windows along the mantled roof spell out M-O-M for his long-suffering, wrongly accused Irish mom. So, I want to thank you all for joining me for this on the 150th anniversary of the Great Chicago Fire.